Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have a great webinar and some great guests to talk to today. The title of the webinar is DevOps Culture Shift, Expanding OnCall Responsibilities, a pretty interesting subject, and I think you're going to get some good stuff out of this today. I am Todd Vernon, CEO of VictorOps, the one speaking right now. I would consider myself an industry veteran of SaaS businesses. I've been doing them about 18 years now, so I've seen the ugliness since 1997. But more importantly, I think I've seen the way things have shifted. So I'm excited to talk about this today. I've basically had 3 companies all in the SaaS space, all of them pretty high transactional type businesses. We built the software, we deployed the software, we lived with the software, and we supported it. So I've seen a lot of that in my career, and I think we're going to have some really interesting stuff to talk about today. I have a few slides just to kind of kick it off and sort of set the goal of what we're doing, but also sort of frame the conversation a little bit. The next few slides are predominantly my personal opinion, and it may not be shared by the rest of the panelists, but they might be also, so it's going to be kind of interesting to see. I kind of frame this in a yesterday versus sort of today. You know, over the years since I started, you know, in these kind of businesses in '97, you know, developers developed. That's what they did, right? And a lot of them chose that career because they like to do that, and they sort of like to be able to sit there and think of hard problems and solve them. You know, we spent a lot of time back in 1997 through 2005 writing product requirements. We often failed at writing software because we spent so much time writing requirements. We push new code every 3 to 6 months into production because that's the way we liked it, and that's about as fast as we could actually get it done. And when it worked, after 12 hours of messing around with it, we locked the data center door and backed out and didn't let anyone in there. And that's largely how reliability was obtained in those days, by not changing things at all. Obviously, this wasn't a great model. Didn't make the companies very, you know, our company or anyone else very responsive. It was very hard for us to release new features. And as a SaaS business, that is exactly, you know, what you're supposed to do, right? That's your competitive advantage. You don't have to ship software. Yet we didn't really realize that back in those days. But it did keep everything stable. So if I kind of compare and contrast that to today, it's a much different world. In a way, development is the new knock. Agile has replaced waterfall successfully in most companies. I don't know what the statistic is, but it's very high penetration now. Kurt probably knows that. Virtual has replaced physical in all but a handful of types of companies. You know, Puppet and Chef have largely replaced the system admins. That is a role that needs to change if you're going to stay current. And continuous delivery, frankly, has replaced lack of delivery. Like, we just didn't deliver stuff back then because that's sort of what we did. Now we deliver code, you know, many times a day often, and in some of the larger organizations that I'm sure many of our audience members have heard about, you know, it can be hundreds of times a day they push code. And DevOps is replacing operations. Not for all companies and not right away, but it's a clear handwriting on the wall that these changes are happening. And perhaps the most controversial statement on here, and part of what we're talking about today, is I honestly believe developers are replacing the knock. We see that in our customer base every day. Our customers tend to be very forward-thinking customers who just don't want that first responder to be somebody that actually can't do anything about the problem. So I think it makes for a kind of a meaty subject to sort of talk about, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. Fortunately, for everyone listening, I have invited smart people, not just opinionated ones like myself, to join, and I'll introduce each of these people as they speak. But good people. I have Kurt Bittner here from Forrester, and Nick Goodman from Bunchball, and Paul Beltrani from Onshape. The last two there are customers of ours, just for full disclosure, enjoying our wonderful service. Housekeeping. There's just a few things you need to know about the webinar today. The first part, it'd be basically 3 parts. The first part is going to be a part by Kurt where he talks about a new brief he put out, which I was delighted to see. I was lucky to have breakfast with Kurt a few weeks ago after this came out, and we didn't have anything to do with it other than, I thought it was super interesting. His brief has put developers on the front lines of app support, and like I said, we see that every single day. So I was excited to have that breakfast and hear a little more about it, which kind of gave us the idea to have this webinar. So I think you're going to hear some good stuff from him. The second part will be thoughts from two of our guests who are real practitioners of this. These are people that have, if you will, drank the Kool-Aid about, we got to get development more involved in sort of the support functions of the business. So I think you're going to hear some good stories there. And then the third section is a Q&A section, and you'll have the ability through the webinar here to ask questions that'll get queued. You can also tweet stuff with the hashtag DevOps structure, and we'll pick those up and pick some good questions out of that stuff. And then we have some preloaded questions too. So I encourage you to think about that stuff, and as you listen to the rest of the webinar, sort of feed it in. And we'll try to get to that as we have time. First thing we're going to do is kick off a little poll here, which we're curious to see, so hopefully you'll be seeing this in a second. And the question is, how many of you that are listening put developers on call today? And I want to differentiate the question slightly from just that sentence in that I think in every organization, especially SaaS businesses, very often a developer ends up in the remediation step, but they might not be an official part of an escalation schedule. I'd like to know how many companies have actually placed development in an escalation schedule, that they are part of the sort of the alert stream, because I think that would be kind of an interesting thing to see. Just as kind of a side thing, we do that here at VictorOps. Obviously, we're in the space. We drink the Kool-Aid and we eat the dog food. And in spite of that, it's still been a thing, right? To get people to lean into that sort of behavior. And I think we're going to hear some good stuff from some of the other panelists as well. But it is a culture shift. It was for us a while back, and we drew the line. And I think we're pretty happy with the way that's turned out. I'm not going to tell you a lot about that just because I have great panelists. So if we look at the results here, what do we have? Let's see. Yes, always, 63%. That's fabulous. Yes, sometimes 0, and no, never is 38%. Oh, that's good. It's a good kind of mix. It's very polarized. So we'll see if we change anybody's mind or what happens as we kind of go on here. The first part here, I want to introduce Kurt Bittner. He's a principal analyst at Forrester. I've had the good fortune to talk to Kurt several times as he lives in this physical location when he's not in aluminum tubes, as he was talking about earlier. Kurt is a leading expert on Agile and iterative software development approaches, including application lifecycle management. He focuses on organizational and cultural shifts necessary to extract broader business value from software development processes. So that's some good stuff. With that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Kurt to give some thoughts that he's got on this subject.
Great. Well, thanks, Todd. As Todd mentioned, this is based on a report that we did earlier this year, and based on some DevOps research we've been doing over the last 2 years. And what we found, if you go to the next slide, is that there are fundamental cultural differences between Dev and Ops, and that's really the starting point for a lot of organizations. They've set up a situation in which they're actually structurally separating Dev and Ops, but also they've created a situation in which Dev and Ops are incented to do different things, and this is at the heart of where the conflict between Dev and Ops arises. So, Dev, they reward them for making as much change as possible, doing lots of releases, doing lots of innovation, lots of new features. But they don't actually hold devs accountable for the performance or the stability of those features. They hold operations responsible for that stability, and the natural way to achieve stability is to minimize change, or at least that's what operations has tended to think. But what we've learned as part of this whole DevOps journey that we've all been on is that the way to introduce stability actually is to do the things you're not very good at a lot, because then you get better at them. So we need to change the incentives for so basically we have to change the incentives for both Dev and Ops and focus on customer success. And customer success requires both innovation, because if you don't have innovation, your customers go somewhere else. And if you don't have stability, no matter how innovative you are, if your application crashes all the time, the customer goes somewhere else too. So if we look at that, essentially what we need to do is measure everybody the same way. And part of that means measuring devs on stability, and part of that means measuring ops on innovation. But the best thing is to reward everybody on improving the customer experience, which relies upon both innovation and stability. So one of the things that really starts to change the mindset of developers is that when they actually have to do what ops does, when they see the impact of deploying a new feature that isn't stable, and they're the ones who bear the brunt for that. So, we think of this, phrase, walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. Well, the reality is that the development equivalent of that is being on call. If you're on call and you're the one who has to answer and fix it when something goes down rather than somebody else, then you're much more aware of what's going on. So if we think about this, one of the other benefits of putting developers on call is that it does a couple of things. Many organizations have this situation where they have one expert on an application, especially an older one, and if that person's on vacation or they're not available or they leave the company, then you lose all that knowledge. Well, one of the interesting things that happens when you put developers on call and they're responsible for somebody else's application is it starts spreading the tribal knowledge of what that application's about, knowledge of the code, knowledge of where things break, knowledge of maybe some of the weakness points in it. And ultimately, over time, it makes things better because you get more eyes on it. It's essentially a kind of ex post facto way of doing peer reviews and pair programming. So one of the interesting comments, speaking with Mario Cruz, who's the CIO at Choose Digital, he has an interesting quote here. If you write code, you're on call, and if you want to take vacations, you write good tests. I think being on call is another way of writing good tests in the sense, or it forces you to write good tests, because you start thinking about what incidents are coming up and you start incorporating that into your continuous integration-based test suite. And so over time, the code gets better, it gets more resilient, it's more fault tolerant. There's some interesting techniques that other companies, Netflix is famous for the chaos monkey capability, where they literally inject defects into the production environment, into testing environments, so they start getting people to get outside their comfort zone and build new things in. But I think this whole, just having the awareness of what the applications do in production gives you a lot of insight into what your test should be. So one of the benefits of doing this is that you start thinking end to end, and we find that the more time that developers spend working with the production apps, working with customers, that they basically start to learn what it takes to make a really resilient application. They become more aware of more than just the functionality, but the entire totality of what it takes to really produce a great customer experience. And the interesting thing we found in our research is that when you do that, when you connect developers to customers in a more direct way, it's actually motivational. People feel more empowered by what they're doing. They feel more that what they're doing is more valuable. And one company we spoke with said that when they interviewed new hires, this was a key factor in choosing the job. How connected were the developers going to be with customers? So this is something that's starting to emerge among let's say, the more millennial, generation of the developer community. But basically, people want to feel like they're making a difference, and so putting developers on call actually is the starting point for giving them that kind of exposure and empowerment. So I like this quote by Winston Churchill, in a sense, the price of greatness is responsibility. If you're not really responsible for what you're delivering, then you don't really have the opportunity to be great, to produce great experiences, and to do great things for customers. And ultimately, that's what we find on a day-to-day basis. what motivates people. The money's nice and all those other things are nice, but you want to feel that what you're doing is making a difference. And to do that, you really have to take responsibility for the application that you're putting into production. So from a developer's perspective, putting the developers on call is really the entry point for that journey. It's not the end point, but it's certainly the one that starts to raise awareness. And back to Todd.
Yeah, for sure. I want to follow up on one thing you said there before I introduce Nick. Something I've noticed at VictorOps is developers don't want to be awesome operations people. And that's actually counterintuitive, but a good thing. Instead, what they do is they tend to write more automation. They tend to update run books and build rules so that when they get alerted, they get the results along with it. They don't want, they want to be out of the loop. Whereas a great ops person, historically kind of thrives on the chaos. So I think there is a sort of this counterintuitive thing where you might get a little more stability out of it just because they don't really want the job in the first place.
Well, that's been the interesting thing we've seen is that the DevOps really began when developers started, or people with development skills went into operations and they started seeing all sorts of things that they could automate and make more resilient through automation. And so it's been a change. Maybe there's a reason why it's DevOps and not Ops Dev, but in effect, it's taking those developer skill sets and applying it to the ops problem that's really made the difference.
Great. Right. We'll get back to some questions here after we hear from our other two gentlemen. Next up is Nick Goodman. He's the Director of Platform Engineering at Bunchball. Nick's teams deliver gamification solutions via a SaaS platform. As the Director of Platform Engineering, Nick oversees the software development and support of the Bunchball SaaS platform, which for the past year has also included shifting Bunchball to a DevOps culture and building out a dedicated DevOps team. Nick, why don't you jump in and take it from here and give us a few of your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, and you guys' last comments are a perfect segue. Bunchball was about a year ago switched to really a low ops culture, which led to a DevOps culture. Had a couple of people with a kind of development mentality starting to drive us and saying, hey, we need to do something different. And so we kind of settled on DevOps. And for us, that actually started with developers being on call. And that was really due to sheer necessity more than any huge business driver or really great thinking. And for us, it really has all been about DevOps culture. We see it as a culture of creation. Every person within the organization, especially those in our on-call rotation, every last one of them is responsible for creating something. We have QA engineers on call. They are responsible for creating automated test suites, automated integration tests, and having visibility into on-call helps them do that, helps them understand how customers use our software and how our software fails. We have a dedicated DevOps team, and that team also is responsible for creation of frameworks and infrastructure that are highly supportable and highly resilient. And the same thing goes for developers. They're not only creating their code, they're also now responsible for how that code works in production. For us, it's also DevOps is about empowerment. It's no longer, no, you can't do it. It's, yes, here's how you can do it well. And part of that is we have a huge preference for using code over knowledge about infrastructure. So like we saw earlier, Puppet and Chef and other configured code or systems as code we use pretty heavily. And that means that even our developers who may not ever want to write Puppet code can at least poke around in it and start to understand it. And we have actually seen that we went from no developers who could even understand Puppet to several of our more senior developers are actually able to go in and make minor modifications. One of the other great things is the developers are starting to feel responsible for their code's behavior. I see this both as part of the DevOps mentality and also directly due to developers being on call. It was not particularly pleasant at first, but especially as they've all had applications now break in production and somebody else got the alert, I think they now all feel responsible to each other for both doing a good job while they're on call and also writing good code so that other people aren't woken up in the middle of the night. The other cultural aspect for us is that DevOps helps us be product-centric. So we want to care about the things that customers care about. We want to care about the API having a high uptime. We want to care about all the services the customers depend upon actually working. And so this mindset of putting everybody on call and having the customer front and center helps us ignore things that don't matter, like IT infrastructure. Like, who cares if a salesperson's laptop isn't working? I'm sure he or she cares, but we don't, because that's not part of our customer's experience. It's also all about our roles exist to deliver the product, and if you can't prove that your product is working in production, I'd claim maybe it's not working. If you don't have automated tests that prove that it's going to work in production, why do you think it will? It also really lets us focus on the things we want to be good at. So it makes us ask hard questions. If we can't build a piece of infrastructure without it being automatable and reproducible and testable, why should we? Why should we be concerned about this thing? Can we outsource it? Can we live without it, or can we do something better? Next slide, please. From a practical perspective, DevOps has been a hard transition for us. It's definitely not been all roses. Early on, putting people on call was hard. A lot of our engineers have never worked in situations where they'd been on call before. I often heard things like, I'm not a sysadmin, or I'm not a DBA, and in reality, people don't really want to be one. They don't want to understand the intricacies of various aspects of the system. And then we also saw a lot of people going, well, shouldn't that alert go to the team that wrote that code? And it really came down to, hey guys, there's a lot of code out there, and you wrote a small fraction of it, so you don't really want to be permanently on call for like the one application that you wrote that's in production. What you want is your application to be good enough that it doesn't break very often, and when it does break, it's clear what's broken and how to fix it so that somebody who's a smart person but not intimately familiar with your code can deal with it. The other really big and interesting challenge for us has been that this sort of mindset shift and technology shift has created different problems. Not necessarily bad problems to have, but like for us, a lot of we shifted to Docker as a result of much of our DevOps cultural shifts. We wanted something that was more easily deployable, wanting something that was more directly monitorable, tighter granularity, and that's caused all sorts of challenges. The monitoring is very different, and more than that, we even have to change our code to support the on-call structure. We have to change our code to support the DevOps structure. And I think that's a really good thing, because it's forcing us to decide where we're going to focus. It's forcing us to decide if we really care about this piece of code running well, let's go make it fit into the structure that we know we can keep running. And for us, that's led to a dedicated DevOps team. And that does not mean a dedicated on-call team of DevOps people. It doesn't mean that they're this magic second tier, even though we do have a multi-tiered system. They're an engineering team dedicated to building out infrastructure and platform and tools, and really setting the path towards how we write all of our code and develop all of our systems to be maintainable and scalable for the long haul. I will pass it back to you, Tom.
Okay, great. Yeah, very interesting stuff. Definitely stuff I want to catch up with in the question area. Just kind of an aside question, has not a ton to do with this, but I think it is sort of related, is do you think Docker seems more logical to devs than VMs do?
I think it does. For us, we had a little bit of legacy operational systems in place that were all about VMs, and the Docker container has been something that we can kind of agree on, where devs can play a little bit more and have maybe a little bit more control within Docker. But we actually went to Docker just because we believed it would be a more reliable and more repeatable production process over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had never considered this until you were started to talk about it and how you've kind of made the shift. I obviously pay attention to Docker, but I'm the CEO. I left my coding hat behind a little while ago. But it just seems more logical to me coming from where my brain space was. So you made me think of that. Thanks for that. That's great. That's some great stuff. I want to get on now to Paul Beltrani. He leads Tech Ops at OnShape. Paul's previous roles include Director of Systems Engineering at Athena Health Incorporated, and he was a Principal Architect at DataZoo. And as we talked before we got him on the webinar, I feel you on that. Anything in the ad tech space is a challenging thing. OnShape is a startup that applies cloud, web, and mobile technologies to CAD, which is kind of a cool thing. Paul was brought on board to quickly mature the startup operations at OnShape, which that sounds like a challenge sometimes. I mean, I've been around companies where that's a challenge. Maybe it wasn't a challenge at OnShape, but I have certainly talked to a lot of people in your space who got a new sort of were hired to come in and help a fast-growing company, and that's how I end up talking to them, because they find our solution. So. With that, let you present some of your thoughts, Paul.
Thanks, and I appreciate the sympathy. If you guys want to flip to my first slide, I'll blow through this fairly quick. Leave some time to talk afterwards. But if I'm not seeing my first slide, is that actually up?
We think so.
Maybe, maybe not. Oh, actually, I can do it from here. Awesome. All right, I'll let you guys. I've got a backup, but I'll let you guys tell me when I'm up, slide-wise.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Look at that.
There we go.
Looks like we're good.
Look at a bunch of times.
Cool.
We use my dad's troubleshooting methodology. We just clicked it a bunch of times.
Yeah, software's hard. I get it. So I'll go through this. I've got 3 slides, but I'll be quick. The first one, I'm not going to read all this to you, but the takeaway from this is we've got some really smart people here who come from a completely desktop background. So the development team here is the same guys that developed most of them are the same people that developed a product called SolidWorks. So it's very desktop oriented. So not only is there no concept of a SaaS or web services, but there wasn't even a concept of ops. So trying to get that DevOps culture here has been frankly a bit of a challenge. But we, like you mentioned, started with bringing developers on call. We figured that would be a good way to kind of get them into the process. And if we can hop to the next slide. There we go. Awesome. And there's a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional role of on-call and how we've changed that a bit in a follow-on slide. But as Nick mentioned, you've got developers who they don't want to be sysadmins, or they've never dealt with this, and kind of throwing them in off the deep end and saying swim would just, aside from being not effective, right, it's just not fair. So we did a few things. We've got a lot of support and guidance from people that have more of a background in an operational space and more of a SaaS space. So we've gone to a partnered on-call schedule so that when somebody who focuses on dev is on call, they've got somebody alongside them who's also a primary on call who focuses on operations. And the beauty of this is now it's kind of a mentoring process, and it works both ways. As developers are getting more of a feel for how the infrastructure operates and how to deal with that, the people who are focusing more on operations and tools are getting a much better handle on how the code operates and how the various services speak to each other. The other thing we tried to do here is, again, to make the transition as easy as possible for the people who've never done this before. There's a lot of group and user autonomy, right? If you've got some say over what you're doing, it makes your life a lot more pleasant. So yeah, they've got to be on call, but at least they get to decide. The management that manages the engineering team gets to control that schedule and that rotation. One of the things we liked about the VictorOps product is, people can figure out how they're going to be alerted and in what order. We just tell them the policy, at a certain point, if you haven't acknowledged, it's going to escalate up the chain. But how you get acknowledged in that initial contact is up to you. And we let people manage their own thing. But what we did do, thank you, next one, is a big part of this is actually changing the definition of what on-call does, at least in this organization. Nick had a great line about, people are like, well, I'm not a sysadmin, right? I got a lot of that. But I don't know how to fix, or I don't know how to. And that's one of the reasons we have that kind of mentoring process and that paired on-call. But the other thing is we changed the definition. So right now our on-call people, if you can fix the problem, awesome, do it. But your real primary responsibility is to be the incident manager. Your job is to make sure that the service is running for our customers, and if it's not, to manage that incident until it's been resolved. But you can do whatever you need to do there, right? So if you're not a sysadmin and you don't know how to deal with certain services, you are empowered to call whoever you need to help with that. And that basically now we've got a point of contact to run the show when there's a problem. And I think that's been very helpful for our dev folks in that it kind of takes that worry of, it's not my skill set, how am I going to deal with it? They're all smart people. They can handle, okay, I just need to make sure that I've got the right people addressing the problem. Going forward, I would like to, this is an ongoing process, having 2 primaries on call all the time, especially for an organization our size, we're only about 60 or 70 people right now, is a bit overkill. But again, we're doing that for that knowledge transfer. At some point, we'll get a little bit more fine-tuned, and maybe our alerting will be a little bit more fine-tuned, so we only pick the people we need to alert. But that's been our experience, and hopefully in the discussion we can talk more to that if people have questions.
Great, thank you. I want to remind people if they want to submit some questions, we've got some in there now, but if you want to get them in the queue so we can take a look at them. One thing I wanted to follow up with you was, and I think if there's kind of a gem in today's presentation, I picked it up when we've had the opportunity to talk in the past, and that was about this incident manager or incident commander. I think that's a super kind of powerful construct that you can almost see the relief on people's face when you're sort of rolling this out and having that meeting where they're like, like UI guys, right? I don't know the back end. How would I possibly? There's no way I could do anything about this. But then when you sort of explain the concept of, no, you're just responsible for tracking it to ground and staying with it until it's solved. We don't, you're not, you might not be the full stack developer that can look at everything or knows the database, but you're just the responsible party. And that has a unique value to a team that has just a general rotation because they don't get woke up in the middle of the night, right? You're just taking that first call for somebody because, the instinctual thing is to say, well, just route it to exactly the right person. And we are believers in that here because we have a tool that allows you to route. But also, there's always stuff that won't get routed right? If somebody catches it and you share that responsibility, that is a tangible thing to the guy that didn't receive it, right? So it may not have felt, great to you, but it felt great to the other guy. So to me, as I looked at kind of the material for today, it's like the most kind of down-to-earth, tangible thing, is like this idea of incident commanders, and I think that really kind of makes people feel a little bit better about stuff. I don't know if anybody else has any opinion on that, but that one really struck me out of the conversation we had the other day.
Yeah, I find that, this is Nick, I find that actually interesting because we've taken a kind of a different approach. We do say you're responsible for fixing it, and yes, that might mean getting somebody else. But one thing that's led us to is trying to make all of the software report similar metrics and have similar systems for how you debug them and correct problems so that you're not having to know 15 different systems, you're really knowing only 1 or 2.
Sure. And just to be a little bit more clear on how we're doing this, we did it for that exact reason that Todd mentioned about we've got people who really don't have operational experience, don't have sysadmin experience, right? They know geometry and C code to a level that very few people, frankly, in the industry do, but their core is not operations or even systems administration. So this was more of a way for still getting them in the rotation, helping share some knowledge, but I want to be clear, it's not like you don't have to fix it. You just wake up the other person, right? We haven't replaced the electronic automation with carbon-based automation to just page somebody, right? We do expect you to make an attempt at it, and that's why, like, I think I kind of glossed over the bullet point, but like what's important here is good procedures and good run books, and we haven't talked about this, but like, 5 whys the following day, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes, so that you can kind of hopefully prevent that from happening again, or getting better documentation, right? You've got that continuous improvement process. So you're expected to give it a shot. Like, we'd like you to fix it. But I wanted to relieve some of that pressure, especially for people who, like, I literally saw some developers that had a look of fear when we told them that they would have to take OnCall. And this is no joke. I mean, seriously. And now those developers will still tell you that they don't like being on call, but they will also tell you that it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
This is Kurt. But what does it say that when the people who produce the software are afraid to support it?
Yeah.
They know where the skeletons are.
Skeletons are buried, but a lot of, I have seen the same fear you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I was going to ask this question a little later, but since we hit the point pretty hard, I fundamentally believe, and I'm curious to hear everybody else's opinion about this, is once developers, and some lean right in, right? To be honest, like, I've seen some developers are just like, yeah, awesome, like there's nothing worse as a developer, having been one for a large portion of my career, than someone not using your code, right? That's like the worst. I wrote code, no one uses it, it bums me out. So there's some that just get kind of jazzed about it because they're sort of in the mix, and companies that have adopted tools like New Relic you can sort of see the instrumentation of it, so that's sort of a level of excitement too. But a secondary thing I have noticed is, sort of again, once you sort of get past that fear or that rollout stage, I think they're generally happier in their companies because they tend to know more about what's going on in the company. They're not this pure algorithmic specialist, that does something. They actually tend to know the customer names because they support the issues. They have a sense of revenue of the company or the ramp rate, and it just makes them kind of more well-rounded. I don't know if either of you guys or Kurt, if you've heard this from some of the people you've talked to, but I have seen it.
Yeah, this is Kurt. I definitely have seen that it's a good way of basically making people feel more engaged in the business itself and in the customers. So I think that's as I mentioned before, really empowering for people. It's not for everybody. So as both Paul and Nick mentioned, some people, that's not the job that they signed up for. And Todd, I know you've had some experiences with that some developers say, I'm not going to do that. And what was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, straight up, we had an issue where when we rolled this out a while back, one of our mobile developers said, that's not what I do. And I said, I totally respect that, and I'll help you find a position somewhere else, because that's exactly what we do. So, it's not like it's easier, even if you're in the space and writing software to help people. It's just like we're adamant about it, right? We feel this way, and those introductory slides with some of the what could be construed as controversial content, we believe wholeheartedly, and we put our actions where our words are, for sure.
One thing that's really helped. This is Nick. One thing that's really helped us on, I think, is breaking down barriers. Because before we started this process, we had a front-end team and a back-end team, and the back-end team, even though they weren't maybe officially on call, they did a lot more of that production support. And I think maybe some of them had a bit of an ego about it. Hey, I'm the one who gets woken up in the middle of the night because I'm so important. And I think some of the front-end developers maybe felt a little like if they tried to have input on these systems, they'd get, no, you're not really involved in that, go away. And putting everybody on call has helped break down those barriers, makes every developer and engineer in the company a lot more equal. And I've seen definitely a maybe a cultural shift with maybe a little bit more respect between the teams. The front-end guys and women know more about what the back-end developers have been doing, and the back-end devs are no longer the only ones responsible.
Yeah, no, I totally see that. So just to put a finer point on the question that Kurt asked was, what do you do if people just say no when especially if you're just rolling this out, right? Because I think that tends to be the inflection point in an organization, and it's probably worse, to be honest, the older the company is. But have either of you sort of had that opportunity where somebody goes, you know what, that's awesome, I'm not doing that?
Yeah. Kurt or Nick, go ahead.
I was just say for us, it was hard. We had to convince people to do it, and the way we convinced them is we said, you know what, we're forcing this on you for 10 weeks. I don't remember. I think it was 10 weeks. We're forcing this on you for 10 weeks, and we will have a group-wide retrospective after 10 weeks, just like you do for any agile process, and figure out what's working and what's not and change it. So we empowered them to make improvements in the process to where it was good enough to meet their needs and their desires.
Yeah, we had a fair amount of resistance, as I said. We're coming from we made that huge leap from desktop to WebOps. I mean, there wasn't anything in between for many of these guys, and by guys I mean people, right? We've got plenty of women on the team. Most of them were like, okay, I don't really like this, but it's now part of my job. There were a few people, as I said, who were open to doing whatever the company needed. I mean, we are a startup, right? So, but they were just afraid of it. They had no idea what it would be like. I'm sure they've heard the horror stories from other places of like, what it's like to be on call. We only had one, maybe two people that were like, I don't do on call, and that one was addressed, frankly, with a couple of conversations, and at some point, their management just said, you do on-call, or we will politely help you find another location to work as well. But for the people that were afraid, I actually got to the point where I'm like, look, I see you guys are nervous about this. This is why we've got, you're the primary, but there's another primary that's there with you. There's a secondary if all heck breaks loose. And frankly, you've got my mobile number. When you're on call, if you are swamped and you don't know what to do, you can call me. I didn't do that for everybody, but for the few people that I could see were like trying, we're just afraid. I think that helped.
Yeah, we did a similar thing here. We had sort of the OnCall Buddies program going on, and the retrospectives were an important part of that. And I think you kind of, at the end of the day, it's not for everybody, but I think it better start being for more people because the world's changing, and maybe you can escape it if you're, in embedded systems where, you ship code in a device and there's nothing you can kind of do about it real time anyway, but I think a lot of the world is SaaS, and that's just the reality of a SaaS business these days. Certainly the way I feel about it.
We also tried to keep it very flexible. I was saying we tried to keep it very flexible to make trading not just easy but encouraged. So if somebody wanted to go to a ball game, we tried to make it so that developers and engineers didn't feel like they had to disrupt their lives for on-call. That on-call would shift around their lives instead of the other way around.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I'll pimp the easy handoff feature in our product for that.
Yep, pretty awesome.
But actually, and we do the same. That's our reasoning for. I don't know if you guys do a secondary on call, but we have the concept of a secondary, which we haven't really needed. Our primaries have picked up and been fine, but the idea being that the person who's secondary is really relief during the day. So that you're not on call 24 hours should badness have happened. It fortunately hasn't happened to us, but I've been in other organizations where the on-call person is firefighting all night, literally, and then expected to come in and do 8 hours the next day, and that's just not reasonable. So that's where the secondary comes in. They're their backup, and they're their first go-to of you know what, hey, I'm going to go grab dinner with my spouse. Can you just watch it for 2 hours because you're my secondary. And that's worked out well.
Yeah, we do that too. Somebody's actually covering me on call right now.
So your phone doesn't go off while you're on the call.
Yep.
Perfect. So I have sort of some of the questions have been, kind of down in the weeds, which is good. I think the subjects we've talked about in the weeds are really good. I have one that's kind of a little higher up that I like to ask people. So a pattern that we see a lot, we sell to a lot of DevOps people, right? We tend to be very DevOps-centric who buys our product. But what we see is, and specifically in more mature companies, is they had, they sort of had traditional processes. They anointed a group as the DevOps group. So they have now created 5 people who, let's say, are, sort of the thinkers in this space. How are we going to change culture? And then, in some companies you see, okay, that's actually expanded more and now we don't have operations. And in some companies it goes deeply into dev, right? And everybody has some kind of on-call. Isn't it all just one day DevOps? I mean, is there really different roles, or are these different stops on different train platforms of a journey that's taking us to the point where if you write code, you're responsible for it, and code is infrastructure and code is delivery, and it's all just code. It's just the world takes a while to get there, and it's maybe this is a 10-year train ride we're on. I'm curious to hear what people think. Maybe I'll start with Kurt on this one. It's a higher level concept, so maybe he's thought about it more than I have, but that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, my belief is that this is really the way that ops is going to work, and dev is going to work. It is you've mentioned, I think all three of you have mentioned that, this is very oriented towards SaaS. So, the on-prem, there's a lot of software out there that isn't SaaS, probably will never be SaaS. That's probably going to take a long time for it to evolve. We think that over time, even those traditional applications will evolve towards more SaaS-like characteristics. So they're good practices, but it's going to be a decades long. I mean, look at Agile. Agile has nominally probably a 30% penetration rate into the overall IT project space right now, with another 30% or so of people who are doing kind of a hybrid Agile approach, and that's after 15 years.
Right.
So this is. But the things that I find is that Agile is almost a pure behavioral change. This one is really reinforced by a lot of other things happening in the industry right now. Nick mentioned containerization as being a big thing. That's going to change the nature of ops and the nature of what devs do and how they deploy. There are other things that really make this a compelling, maybe even a more compelling change than Agile in some ways, because it's not purely behavioral. It's something that you can automate. So the change may happen faster, but it's not a 3 to 5 year horizon. It's probably more like a 5 to 10. But the benefits are compelling. It's simply the way I think people are going to work. And to give you some of the more leading companies have gone as far as banishing the console. So there is no more console. Everything is done through infrastructure as code. That's more at the front end of this on-call process. But these techniques are infiltrating, and the benefits are substantial enough that we think that it'll become pervasive over time.
Great. You guys have a thought on this really quickly? We're almost out of time, and I want to ask one more question because I'm like that.
I'll just jump in real quick. I think you're right that there's going to be less and less of that idea of the traditional ops person. But I still think you're going to have areas of focus, right? And I think that's, in my opinion, that's what a lot of DevOps is. So you're going to have the people who are focusing on code and focusing on infrastructure, and they may be different teams, different people. But the idea of we're all in it together and we're all operating this machine, I think is going to prevail.
Yeah, I completely agree with Paul. That's what I've been seeing too.
Yeah, for sure. So one final kind of question, then I want to wrap it up really quick. And this is one I struggle with, to be honest with you, because I have noticed, when we're very, DevOps oriented, we're very push to production oriented, and obviously everyone carries the pager at our place. Is there such thing as no ops? And the reason I say that is because there is still a fundamental behavioral difference in devs and true operations people, where true operations people think 4 times before they push the button. Even if it's a push the button operation, they'll think 4 times before they do it. Where it's much more common for a dev to just push the button, and without consulting maybe the fact that a new customer just rolled out, and while we believe there's no impact, there may be some risk to it. It's just more of a culture thing, which makes me suspicious, and maybe it's just because I'm 51, that no ops doesn't really exist, but I'm a total believer in DevOps. Does anybody have just a quick couple, like a minute thought on that?
Yeah. Under your definition of ops, we have no operations engineers at OnCall. We have no ops in that sense.
Cool.
I think even the people with operations titles are the infrastructure should be good enough that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, I think you're actually, both views are right. I think though you will still have people who tend to focus on what I would call an operational mindset, and you may not have an ops team anymore, but you really kind of do want people that have those operational instincts kind of helping run that show.
Yeah, skills, I find the skills really helpful because they ask questions the developers don't know to ask.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the crux of it for me. Is just and I think it's maybe a responsibility thing that's still in transition. When you realize you can actually blow the universe up with a keystroke, it's having that knowledge, and it's a bit like touch the burner. You sort of have to touch the burner once, and then you'll be a little more careful doing that next time. Okay, I am going to wrap this up. We're almost out of time. I really appreciate everybody that joined, Nick and Paul and Kurt especially for coming here and being here in person. Good stuff. You will be able to access this online. I think we're going to send it out to all the people that registered and the participants. Are we also distributing Kurt's brief, put developers on the front lines of app support, which I think is very cool. That will also come out to everybody that attended and was registered. And just to put in a shameless plug for us at the end, we enable the companies you heard from today, as well as a lot of other companies, and we provide all the full life cycle tools to do some of the things you heard about, from the firefight to the post-mortem and retrospective reporting to annotations of alerts, so that when the answer comes along with the page to enable more junior people to respond to these things and be effective incident commanders. That's what I have for you today. I really appreciate everybody joining the call. I think it was a super interesting subject, and we'll see what we can come up with in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks.